On the night of September 14, 1936, a convoy of military trucks rumbled through the streets of Madrid. The engines growled low and menacing in the darkness. Inside those trucks, packed in wooden crates, was 73% of Spain's entire gold reserve, 510 tons of it. We think Spain lost its civil war because Franco had better guns. We think the Republic fell because Hitler and Mussolini sent planes and tanks. But that's not the whole truth. Spain didn't just lose a war. Spain went bankrupt. The Republic didn't fall on the battlefield first. It collapsed on the ledger. And the man who foreclosed on an entire nation was sitting 1,000 miles away in Moscow. This is not a story about ideology or heroism. This is a story about the greatest liquidation sale in history. A fire sale where a desperate government sold its entire economic foundation to a gangster who never intended to return a single coin. Spain in 1936 was still living off the fumes of empire. For 3 centuries, Spanish galleons had crossed the Atlantic loaded with silver from Potosi and gold from Mexico. The Crown had turned that plunder into the 4th largest gold reserve on earth. 700 tons of bullion sat in the vaults beneath the Bank of Spain in Madrid. That's more gold than most nations had ever seen in their history. You could build a solid cube 2 meters on each side. You could mint enough coins to employ a man counting for years without stopping. This was not just money. This was credibility made tangible. It was the guarantee that Spain's currency meant something, that foreign suppliers would accept Spanish paper in exchange for steel and wheat and oil. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Spain had stayed neutral during World War I, while Europe tore itself apart. Spanish factories sold steel to Germany and France simultaneously. Spanish mines sold coal to Britain and Austria-Hungary without favoritism. And Spain demanded payment in gold, not paper promises, not war bonds, actual physical gold bars that had value regardless of which government collapsed tomorrow. By 1936, Spain had accumulated a fortune that made other nations jealous. But now Spain was the one bleeding. The Spanish Civil War had exploded in July of that year. General Franco's nationalist army was marching on Madrid with German tanks and Italian planes. The Republican government, democratically elected but chaotically organized, was losing on every front. Their militias were brave but poorly trained. Their equipment was antiquated. Their officers had mostly defected to Franco's side, and their supposed allies in Britain and France had declared a policy of non-intervention. That polite diplomatic term meant they would watch Spain burn and do nothing. The Republic was alone, completely alone. But the Republic had one weapon Franco desperately wanted: 510 tons of gold sitting 30 meters underground in blast-proof vaults. If Franco captured Madrid, he would capture the bank. And with that gold, he could buy unlimited weapons from Hitler. He could hire foreign mercenaries. He could purchase all available food and starve the Republican zones into submission. The gold had to be moved. But moved where? That question would haunt Spain for the next 85 years. The decision fell to Juan Negrin Lopez, the Minister of Finance. Negrin was a scientist by training, a respected professor of physiology who had studied in Germany. But he also understood economics at a level most politicians never would. He grasped the mathematical relationships that determined how economies functioned, how gold reserves provided the foundation for international confidence. And he understood that the Republic was trapped. Britain had slammed its door. France was paralyzed by its own political divisions. The United States wanted nothing to do with Europe's wars. Only one major power was willing to answer the phone: the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin looked at the Spanish Civil War and saw multiple opportunities layered like chess games. On the surface, he could fight a proxy war against Hitler without committing Soviet troops. He could test German military capabilities. He could spread communist influence into Western Europe. But most of all, Stalin saw a chance to make money. Enormous amounts of money. Money that could fund Soviet industrialization. Stalin was not a sentimental ideologue driven by romantic notions of worker solidarity. He was at his core a gangster operating on a geopolitical scale, a man who had clawed his way to absolute power through purges and violence. He understood that real power came from controlling resources, from oil and steel and grain and gold. When the Spanish government approached him in late summer of 1936, sending desperate telegrams asking for weapons, Stalin agreed. But he wasn't running a charity. He wanted guarantees. He wanted collateral. He wanted something tangible that would ensure Spain would pay for every rifle and bullet. The plan was hatched over weeks of secret negotiations. Take the gold out of Madrid and ship it to Moscow. Hand it over to Stalin personally. It sounds insane to us now with decades of hindsight. To take the entire accumulated wealth of a nation and hand it to a totalitarian dictator who was conducting show trials and executing his own generals. But you have to understand the desperation. Republican leaders heard artillery getting closer every day. They watched their armies retreat on every front. They saw their appeals to Britain and France rejected with empty promises. They looked at Moscow and saw their only friend, their only ally willing to sell them weapons. They convinced themselves that the Soviet Union was different, that Stalin was fundamentally a benevolent ally who would guard their treasure and return every ounce when democracy was restored. It was a fatal miscalculation. The operation began in total secrecy on September 14th. The order was signed by Negrin and the Prime Minister. The document authorized the transfer of gold reserves to a safe place for protection. Notice the wording. It didn't say Moscow. It didn't say the Soviet Union. It simply said a safe place. Deliberately vague. The physical logistics were staggering. The gold was stored 30 meters underground in vaults protected by massive armored doors. Each door weighed several tons and required 3 officials with separate keys to open simultaneously. There was even a fail-safe system that could flood the entire vault with water if enemies tried to breach it. The vaults were impregnable, but the enemy wasn't breaking in from outside. The enemy had the keys. Over several nights, a strange crew descended into those vaults. Professional locksmiths who knew the mechanisms, bank clerks who knew the layout, and anarchist militia men in overalls who provided the muscle. They disabled the security systems methodically. They opened the massive doors using official combinations. Then they began the back-breaking work of moving the gold. Hundreds of tons of it. The gold was packed in wooden ammunition crates, reinforced with metal bands. Each crate held 65 kilograms of gold. That's 143 pounds of solid metal. Imagine a box small enough to wrap your arms around, but so heavy it takes 2 grown men straining just to lift it. Your back aches. Your hands cramp. You worry about dropping it. Some of the gold was in standard bars stamped with Bank of Spain seals, but half of it was in coins. Millions of individual gold coins from all over the world. British sovereigns with King George's profile. American double eagles with Lady Liberty. French Napoleons. Historic Spanish doubloons that had crossed the ocean from the New World in galleon holds. The men worked in near silence, speaking only in whispers. The air 30 meters down was stale and warm with body heat. They sweated through their shirts, despite the coolness of stone. They hauled the impossibly heavy crates onto metal trolleys and wheeled them to the elevators. Up on street level, waiting in darkness, was a fleet of military trucks. Canvas-covered transport vehicles painted olive green. The drivers hadn't been told what they were carrying, but you cannot hide the nature of gold. When a small box requires 2 men to lift it, when a truck rides so low its wheels nearly touch the fenders, these things tell their own story. Rumors began to spread among workers. They whispered that the Republic was emptying the treasury, but security was tight. The Carabineros Customs Police watched with rifles ready. No one dared speak these suspicions out loud. The destination was Cartagena, an ancient naval port on Spain's Mediterranean coast, 450 kilometers southeast of Madrid. Cartagena had been chosen for specific strategic reasons. It was the stronghold of the Republican Navy. It was surrounded by massive coastal artillery batteries. It was far from active front lines. It had deep-water docks and caves carved into cliffs for military storage. By any measure, it was the safest place left in Republican Spain. The convoy set off in the dead of night. Dozens of heavy trucks winding through darkened Spanish countryside like a mechanical serpent. They drove without headlights to avoid German bombers. The Condor Legion was prowling the skies looking for targets. A long line of trucks would have been irresistible, so the drivers navigated by moonlight and memory. They drove through sleeping villages where peasants were literally starving. These Spanish citizens had no idea that enough wealth to feed them for a century was rolling past their shuttered windows, close enough to touch. There were accidents along the way. The roads were terrible, narrow, unpaved, full of potholes. These trucks were massively overloaded. There were breakdowns, blown tires, seized engines. Trucks abandoned by the roadside with cargo, hastily transferred to other vehicles in darkness. But the security remained absolutely tight. The Carabineros rode at the front and rear with orders to shoot anyone who interfered. When the exhausted trucks finally arrived in Cartagena, the gold was not immediately loaded onto ships. Instead, it was stored in old naval magazines, carved into limestone cliffs. Deep chambers that had been used for centuries to store gunpowder. Now these ancient stone caves held the fortune of Spain. Crate after crate stacked in darkness, guarded by nervous soldiers who understood they were protecting something irreplaceable. For a few tense weeks, the gold sat in those caves while the government negotiated final details with the Soviets. Juan Negrin was in constant communication with Soviet representatives, particularly a man named Arthur Stashevsky, who held the title of Soviet Trade Envoy. But the real power was someone most Spaniards had never heard of, Alexander Orlov. His name was probably fake. NKVD agents rarely used real names abroad. Orlov was the station chief for Soviet secret police in Spain, Stalin's personal representative. He was a master spy trained in espionage, manipulation, and assassination. He had arrived earlier in 1936 to help organize Republican intelligence services. But his real mission was darker. He was there to hunt down and eliminate Trotskyists and anti-Stalinist Marxists. He ran secret prisons in Barcelona. He orchestrated political assassinations. He was the embodiment of Stalin's long, murderous reach extending into Spain. When the gold operation was finally approved, Orlov was the obvious choice to oversee logistics. He coordinated security at Cartagena. He personally selected which Spanish workers would load the ships. He chose only Communist Party members whose loyalty to Moscow was unquestionable. He maintained constant communication with Moscow through encrypted telegrams. Years later, after Orlov defected to America, he described receiving a telegram from Stalin himself. The telegram ordered Orlov to load the gold onto Soviet ships immediately, but it included one more line, a personal note from Stalin. Stalin wrote in his characteristically crude way that the Spanish would never see their gold again, just as they cannot see their own ears. Think about that. Before a single crate left Spanish soil, Stalin had already decided to steal it all. There was no intention of safekeeping, no plan for return. From day one, this was a heist. In late October 1936, the Soviet ships finally arrived. 4 of them. The Kim, the Neva, the Volgols, and the Kursk. They were ordinary merchant vessels painted in drab colors. They looked like ships carrying grain or coal. Anonymous workhorses of international commerce. This unremarkable appearance was deliberate. Orlov didn't want attention. He knew Franco's intelligence had agents everywhere. If nationalists discovered Soviet ships loading something valuable, they would attack. They would send submarines. They would bomb the harbor. They would do whatever it took to stop that cargo. The loading operation began on the night of October 22nd. This was the point of no return. Orlov handpicked every stevedore. He chose Spanish tank crews and military personnel, all Communist Party members. He told them the crates contained ammunition. It was plausible. Cartagena was regularly bombed. Moving ammunition made military sense. But again, the weight betrayed the lie. When it takes 2 men straining to lift a small box, everyone knows it's not gunpowder. The loading was chaotic and tense. It stretched across 3 long nights of continuous labor. The ships were moored in darkness at military docks. The only light came from dim, shielded lanterns. Exhausted workers struggled up narrow, steep gangplanks with impossibly heavy boxes. Every step was a potential catastrophe. One dropped crate could smash open and spill thousands of gold coins. One man losing his balance could send a box splashing into the harbor, lost forever in mud and debris. Orlov stood on the dock throughout these nights watching every movement. His hand never strayed far from the revolver under his coat. He was terrified of a German air raid. If a single bomb hit a ship while it was being loaded, the cargo would scatter across the harbor bottom. But he was equally terrified of sabotage from within. The anarchists who controlled parts of Cartagena hated the communists. If anarchists discovered that the people's gold was being shipped to Stalin's dictatorship, they might attack. They might try to seize the gold for themselves. It could trigger a civil war within the civil war. So Orlov sealed off the entire dock area with troops and machine guns. He posted guards with orders to shoot anyone who interfered. It took 3 nights to load all 4 ships. 7,800 crates, 510 tons of solid gold, roughly 73% of Spain's total reserve. What happened to the rest? About a quarter had been sent to France earlier. That gold became known as the Paris gold. But the bulk of the reserve was now in the holds of 4 Soviet steamers ready to leave Spanish waters forever. On the night of October 25th, the ships cast off. They slipped quietly out of Cartagena harbor and headed east into the dark Mediterranean. 4 anonymous freighters that looked like they might be carrying grain, not the fortune of an entire nation. The voyage from Cartagena to Odessa was perilous. The Mediterranean in late 1936 was effectively a war zone. Italian submarines sent by Mussolini were patrolling looking for Republican shipping. German warships were conducting exercises. Franco's nationalist navy had cruisers and destroyers. If the ships had been intercepted, the gold would have been captured. To avoid this nightmare, the Soviet captains employed every evasive tactic. They hugged the coast of North Africa. They stayed in coastal waters where international law provided thin protection. They maintained strict radio silence throughout the voyage. They were ghost ships, invisible and silent. The journey took weeks of slow, careful navigation. They passed through the Strait of Gibraltar at night. They sailed along the North African coast past Tunis and Tripoli. They navigated through Greek waters and along the Turkish coast, through the narrow Dardanelles Strait, and finally into the Black Sea. In early November, they arrived at Odessa. When the ships docked in Odessa, something fundamental changed. This was the moment when Spain's gold physically entered Soviet territory. Up until this point, there had been a slim theoretical possibility of changing course. But the moment those ships docked, that possibility vanished. The gold was now on Soviet soil, subject to Soviet control. The NKVD took over immediately. The entire port area was cleared. Troops lined the streets. No one except specially authorized NKVD personnel was allowed near the ships. The crates were unloaded directly onto armored trains. Special railway cars with reinforced steel walls thick enough to withstand small arms fire. Armed guards rode in compartments at either end. These trains were built to protect cargo from any conceivable threat. This was the moment when Spain's gold disappeared from independent verification. From this point forward, everything would be controlled and documented exclusively by Soviet officials. There would be no outside observers, no independent auditors, no international oversight. The armored trains carried their precious cargo north across the vast Russian steppe. They traveled for days through countryside that few Spaniards had ever seen. Eventually they arrived in Moscow. The gold was taken to Gokran, the state depository for precious metals, the Kremlin's treasure house where the Soviet Union kept its strategic reserves. And now in those same vaults would sit the gold of Spain. The counting of the Spanish gold is a story within the larger story. Spanish officials who traveled to Moscow were allowed to be present during counting, but their role was purely as observers. They were not allowed to participate. They were not allowed to touch the gold. They had to stand behind a wooden barrier like museum visitors, watching helplessly as Soviet clerks opened crates and weighed contents. It must have been profoundly humiliating. Spanish treasury professionals reduced to passive spectators while foreigners handled their country's wealth.